Let me read to you a passage from the 10th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, verses 32 to 45. It's the Gospel for Wednesday of the 8th week in Ordinary Time, Year B. St. Mark writes, "The disciples were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. 'We are going up to Jerusalem,' he said, 'and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise.' Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.' 'What do you want me to do for you?' he asked. They replied, 'Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory.' 'You do not know what you're asking,' Jesus said. 'Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?' 'We can,' they answered. Jesus said to them, 'You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared.' When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." That's from Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 45. I suggest it speaks of Christ's courage. What do I mean? Well, you know, there are many examples of heroic courage in history. Some for worthy causes, others not. In his second oration concerning the fortune or virtue of Alexander the Great, found in his work called the Morals in Volume 1, Plutarch describes one extraordinary act of courage by Alexander the Great, not at all untypical of him. Alexander is leading his exhausted army through India, on the verge of mutiny. He directs them to storm the walls of yet another tribal stronghold, and they refuse. Alexander is furious and climbs up a ladder himself to shame his men into action, cutting down the defenders on the wall. There he stands, the enemy's arrows whistling about him. His men shout up at him to come back down. He looks at them for a moment and then jumps down alone into the enemy stronghold itself, where he is attacked from all sides. His extraordinary act of courage inspires and drives his troops to attack from outside and come to his aid. He emerges covered with serious wounds, but the victor. In his writings, Karl von Clausewitz provides historians with judging criteria on matters of war, and he gives several criteria for genius. Courage is his first requirement. In his book On War, published 1989, page 101 to 102. In his first Italian campaign, 1796-97, Napoleon Bonaparte showed tremendous physical courage against the Austrians at Lodi, prevailing and then pursuing them till they sued for peace. Again, one of his most famous later generals was Marshal Michel Ney, finally executed at the end of 1815 for siding with Napoleon at his unlawful return to France. Ney's chief characteristic was his extraordinary, undaunted physical courage, right to the moment of his own execution. There are numerous examples in history of human courage in the face of difficulty and mishap to gain this or that prize. But consider the prospect not merely of being in the thick of fire and sword in battle, but of bearing and atoning for the sins of the whole world. What fire and brimstone pouring down, unseen though, must this have been? The scale of such an affliction is impossible to imagine. The sins of but one person, sins venial and mortal, of thought, word and deed, are incalculable. If this is so, then how beyond all imagining must be the guilt of the whole world before God and man. How appalling must be the prospect facing the one whose mission is to be burdened with it all. There was a man in history whose mission was to be struck with the full force of the sin of the world, to bear it on his shoulders, and by his obedient endurance to atone for it all. He was utterly sinless, and he embraced his task freely, indeed lovingly. It was the greatest task conceivable, and involved the most terrible of sufferings. It was occasioned by his witness to the truth about himself. Whatever examples of courage might occur to us from the annals of history, the mere thought of the dimensions of the world's sin ought indicate to us that the greatest courage was that possessed by Jesus Christ. He undertook to redeem the world from its sin by atoning for it all himself. How appalling a prospect! In our Gospel today we read that, and I quote, "The disciples were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside, and told them what was going to happen to him. 'We're going up to Jerusalem,' he said, 'and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise.'" Mark chapter 10, verse 32 to 45. Now we must not think of Jesus Christ as just bravely facing what he divined would be his death as a result of his confrontation with the leaders of the Jews. He was facing the full force, unseen to human eyes, of the sin of the world. He was about to place himself at the head of the human race of every time and place, and with arms wide open, accept in his own person the consequences of mankind's sin. It would be a holocaust the like of which has never been seen, but virtually unseen nevertheless. All man would see would be a horrible crucifixion, but what was seen was the mere tip of the iceberg of suffering. Christ would bear it all and allow it to work itself out till it was spent in his own obedient death, and thus would he atone for the sin of the world and take it away. In him each man and woman would be freed from its thraldom. The one task left after his work was over was to bring each man and woman into union with him by faith and baptism. Let us marvel at the sheer courage of Jesus Christ, so calm, so steadfast, so silent, so enduring. He is the hero of all time. The trial ahead of him was of a proportion beyond compare. In the garden, this strongest and holiest of men sweated blood at the thought of it, while his closest disciples slumbered. He never faltered, never flinched, and the outcome was never in doubt. He passed through all the grades of suffering and reached its depth and its height, but he remained undaunted. Magnificent man, splendid man, courage beyond compare. Never has the like been seen, nor will it ever be seen. He is our model, our friend, as we strive by the aid of grace to follow in his footsteps.